En fait, deux questions peut-être à la première présentation par rapport à les deux expériences EEG que vous avez présentées. Sorry, in English. Yes. I changed. So, for respect to the EEG experiment, so one question: have you tried? I've not yet read the paper. Have you tried also correlations between the actual size of effect over the motor areas and the extent of aesthetic appreciation or other dimensions of subjective?
Yes, actually we tried, but apparently they were not significantly correlated, unfortunately, was our expectation.
So which I mean, of course,
yeah.
in
At
another
least
effect
the
we can't
amount
learn
of movement, aesthetic appreciation, I'm not that sure because it's so cognitive, while the mechanism activated was very basic, I think, but the amount of movement, at least I was expected, that was correlated with the amount of alpha desynchronization, but unfortunately was not. I think, again, my explanation is that the motor cortex activation during the observation of this kind of images is so low level, very similar to, maybe it's related to the mirror mechanism activation, that is so far from the cognitive response of how much movement do you perceive in this image. As I told you, participants said, what a odd question are you asking me? I cannot see any movement in this image, but anyway, they scored more movement in the original. So maybe the level of description of the behavioral part and the EEG part were so different that this is my explanation for the lack of results.
And if I may just actually question that in a sense follows up part of your response. So you interpret, okay, there was the other work, the behavioral work you showed, which seems to be directly pointing to a motor level interpretation at the actual action, but in your results, we are not sure what this activation in motor areas that seem to be in a very distributed networks mean. Are they actually the movement of the hand? Are they could be interpreted also as about the intentionality of the, I mean, how do we, you know, as an example, we could have taken a work of art that has intentionality in it, but where the movement that created the actual work is much more ambiguous. I don't know, like Pollock or something.
But are you talking about the behavioral study, the one of Topolinsky?
No, I'm talking about the EEG, yeah.
Okay.
You seem to be very directly saying what we find is the actual hand motion of doing the cut, and this is, we can't really say that. I mean, this is too strong interpretation of the result.
Yeah, of course, it's just an interpretation, but what we can say is that we try to, of course, we investigated also the activation of other areas of the brain, but we did not find any activation. Of course, the occipital cortex was the first one that we investigated, but we did not find any significant difference between conditions in this area of the brain, as in parietal cortex. And so, of course, this motor activation is an interpretation of, I mean, the intention could be there, of course, not just the consequence of an action, but of course, intention of action are together with the action per se. So the intention of an action could influence our results. I completely agree. But in terms of brain areas activation, we found just there. So, of course, it's an interpretation. I mean, with very strong experimental hypothesis anyway. So it's.
Thank you. I also have a question for Alessandra Umiltà, which is related with the precedent one, because you stressed the difference between what happened when you focused on the original work by Lucio Fontana and the control work. But I think you showed us that there is a very strong dissimilarity between people familiar and people unfamiliar with Fontana's background. So my question is, what's your comment on the role of plain information about who that artist is and the fact that he did cut canvas as a typical thing and so on? In other words, how can you extrapolate from that towards a comment on the role of education, art, history, information, and so on and so forth? And one addenda to that would be, have you reflected on the fact that this particular work is about a gesture, meaning a kind of violence, namely cutting. Is that important in your study?
Yeah, you're right. I did not think about the emotional component of cutting that could be very interesting. And yeah, it's a good point because we didn't consider at all this aspect, while it has emotional content, of course, this kind of artwork. And the first point was the familiarity. Again, we asked, and the participants were equally divided into groups, familiar and unfamiliar. But this aspect did not affect our results, were not significant. I mean, the familiarity was not a significant factor. We discovered that half of our students knew very well, and so we were worried about the fact that, of course, if you know that what are you looking for, it's a cut on a canvas done by Lucio Fontana, immediately it could be something related to memory or to knowledge or to recalling the gesture of cutting, so it's not the consequence of an action. But anyway, apparently the results were not influenced by this aspect. So, for example, on Klein, 90% of the students didn't know anything about this kind of art, while Lucio Fontana was quite well known. But the familiarity, anyway, in both cases did not affect the results. So apparently something that is automatic is not related to cognitive knowledge, memory, or is an automatically triggered motor cortical activation, not top-down. It's
I might be wrong because the slides were very quick, but I just think there was
I can show you again. It was not significant. The big difference was between the original and the control conditions.
Yes,
the bars were 2 and 2, of course, because we put this one as a factor in the statistic in the ANOVA, but did not result significant. So I can show you again if you want, or later one I show you. No, it was not significant anyway.
Thank you.
Just a quick question, which is more or less related to the previous one. Did you ask for the movie experience? Did you ask the participants their degree of familiarity with cinema, like how often they would go to the movies and stuff like that?
No, honestly, we didn't, because we thought that our video clips were so horrible. The aesthetic experience with real movies was not a critical factor, but maybe, yes, in the future, if we will perform more experiments in this field, of course, it's a question that we have to ask to participants.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for both of those talks. They were fantastic. I have a question for Alessandra about the last study. I noticed on one of the bar graphs that showed people's involvement with the images or the videos.
Which study?
The last one?
The movie stuff, okay.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
People showed or expressed that they felt more involved, if I read the graph right, with the dolly, right?
No, with
or
steady.
The zoom?
No, with steady. Dolly and zoom were basically the same, always together, in EEG and in behavioral. The participants gave more or less the same responses about the one that they said that they felt more involved in was always the Steadicam.
I thought it looked like there was a tiny bit more for
maybe
the
a tiny
ones.
bit. No, the dolly more than the Steadicam. I don't think so. Maybe a bit more than the zoom, but was not significant. So
okay.
It was
okay. But I guess my question is, if that's true, that they're kind of the same in terms of people's involvement, what do you make of the fact that the non-natural, quote unquote, movements of the zoom or the dolly still draw people in? Like how do you account for that involvement and distinguish it, I guess?
Yeah, I think because it's, again, when you usually you move in the world, in the real world, toward a scene, anyway, most of the times you move anyway, so the fact of moving camera per se is effective. Of course, more is embodied, the moving of the camera, more is effective. But usually in the real life, when we always move approaching scenes, objects, so it's the moving per se that is more involving in terms of motor system activation. This is the reason why also the zoom and the still were more effective than still camera. Zoom and, yes.
I got a quick question right there. About Franz Klein, that particular study, I found it fascinating that the control stimuli had the visual pattern of the abstract art of Klein. And the difference that was obvious, the aesthetics, was that on the Klein original work, you see the smudges and the lines being ambiguous, while the control stimuli is very straightforward. I think it's an aesthetic question I'm asking. Is the triggering of the aesthetics on in the control stimuli similar to when they saw the original? I'm not sure if I'm making this clear. It just seems that the observers who see the original abstract work, they have an empathy about that, but when they see the control stimuli, it's just a skeletal structure visually of the thing. Is there a similar pattern going on?
So you mean a silence? The original were more silent comparing with control stimuli, I think.
Right, because there's a very strong similarity abstract in both settings. One is more original because it's smudge and you have the personal signature that creates the art form. But the control substance, all that's gone. It's just black and white. Yeah,
basically lights. Tape. We put tape using Photoshop.
Right, but the thing that I find interesting is that the visual patterns are the same. So is that triggering the same area of the brain, the neurocortex? Or
I mean, in theory, what was in this case, you are. We checked for the visual cortex to see whether the two conditions were different, and apparently they didn't, so we did not find any difference. So it means for us that the control condition was a good control condition in terms of visual pattern, symmetry, because we did not find any difference in terms of visual activation. So the reason why we also performed the source localization was to see whether we found something, was possible to find something just related to the sensory motor. So in this case was not only motor cortex but also sensory cortex. So it means parietal cortex that is related to the sense of touch. So it's very interesting from this point of view because of the original artworks were more related to the also to the texture of the artworks. Yes. Of course, with the original artwork would be ideal to have participants in front of the real artwork in a museum measuring their brain activity. It's much more complicated. It's possible, but it's technically more difficult and much more expensive and less controlled. But in the future, for example, the texture is critical also for sculpture, for example. Moving around the sculpture, I mean, it's a different, but it's just the first level of description.
Okay, thank you.
To your neighbor, please. Yes, to him.
A couple of questions again. About the movie experiment. I didn't exactly understand why you use a scene where someone is grasping something, because why didn't you use a scene of something that allegedly does not activate the mirror system, to see just the activation of the movement of the camera? And why didn't you use also a shoulder camera, something like which evocate even more the movement of the person holding the camera? More than the Dolby and more than the
Steadicam, you mean?
More than the Steadicam, yeah.
Okay, and
in your case, activation due to the action of grasping and the activation due to the camera are superimposed, right?
No, your point is very. And first of all, why grasping? Because I started with monkeys. So for me, I always start with with grasping. Because I know that is something that normally activates the mirror mechanism in humans and in monkeys. So I started with a really classical point of view. And because we already know from the literature there are hundreds of studies showing grasping actions. So we thought this one was the ideal first step to start with moving the camera and comparing still with moving. The second one is very good point. So we are doing the experiment now to see whether the absence of the presence of an agent grasping makes the difference. Because, of course, we have to do the same in an empty room. And we are recording now this data. So with the 4 types of moving camera and in an empty room to see whether it's the moving per se approaching everything or moving toward an agent. And about a camera that was much more moving, more than the Steadicam. The problem is to have a similar stimuli. Okay, again, if you have visually completely different visual stimuli, with this camera jumping, you cannot compare with the other conditions.
And another quick question. I guess that it is the question that you have each time you present these results, but I will ask it anyway. Like if you give me a piece of paper and a knife, I can reproduce the Fontana artwork.
Yeah.
If I am lucky, I will produce something indistinguishable from the Fontana. Mm-hmm. And if you say subject, well, this is Fontana artwork, or this is a cut that I did yesterday myself, would you expect a difference in the motor cortex? And if you don't, what is the point to use an artwork instead of any kind of cut or trace?
Okay, yes, of course. I think if you perform a cut, it will be effective anyway. Again, I started saying that I don't want to measure the symbolic
I see.
Or the intrinsic extra value of a piece of art. I just wanted to see whether there is activation of your whether art fruition, art perception evokes also not only the activation of the visual system, but also the activation of the motor system. So I wanted to investigate the role of the motor system in art perception. And the reason why we choose Fontana's, because here you can really see the activation of the motor system, the gesture of the artist. So it was a starting point again, and then we moved to Klein, and then we will see something else. So it was just because.
Just to make the connection.
We need to move around.
Okay, sorry. Between the two.
I'm trying to keep some order here. So that, but you're next. No? Okay, Andrea.
It's late.
I just want to insist on that. I think it's completely, just following up, I think it's just a trick to use Fontana instead of anything else. So you don't need at all to use Fontana. It makes just everything much more complicated for us.
As I told, a broken egg could be the same.
The same thing is for Klein. I can make my stroke. You have exactly the same sort of responses, I guess. So why use Fontana and Klein? Why don't you use just someone cutting a piece of paper and stroking on a
because
canvas?
They are...
you understand that? Intellectually.
Intellectually.
You are playing a bad game.
No.
Yeah.
No, because they are very powerful. Because I'm convinced that the artist in his mind got the power of his gesture and wanted to transmit the power of this gesture is much more salient than a broken egg. I cannot measure his symbolic value. I cannot measure what happens in the brain of the artist, but I'm convinced that the artist knew that there was something really powerful in the activation of the brain of the observer, and I think it's the motor system in this case, but it's tricky, in a way it's tricky, but it's very fascinating. I mean, it's the link between the observer and the artist.
Let's go back to the discussion we had this morning, the beginning of the discussion we had this morning with Changeux. I mean, already the whole relationship between the two cultures or whatever is complicated enough. But I think that coming from some neuroscientists, and now I put you with this neuroscientist, playing with art. I mean, either it is completely explicit, you're playing with it.
No, art gives us information about how the brain works. This kind of art gives us a lot of information about this. Okay, but doesn't matter.
Okay, you're going to ask a question?
Just to add a little consideration linked to this question, if there isn't any other question.
Well, mine, but never mind.
Okay. No, I think what is interesting is that the investigation that neurosciences are doing about art is producing a specific concept of art as stimulus, a powerful stimulus. So this is, we can appreciate it or not, we can agree or not, but there is something that is changing in our general way of considering art as stimulus. And I think this is an intellectual and cultural problem. You can refuse that, you can accept that this is, let's say, a second step. But I don't think this is just a question about, it's not just a methodological question, it's a cultural question. There is something that is growing, that is becoming always more also invasive in the humanities. And I think this is a point that we have to make very, very clear, even to eventually to refuse this kind of operation. But it's not just an experimental choice.
I agree. It's a way to collaborate. I mean, asking to someone who is an art expert and discussing together which stimuli to employ, the power, how much powerful they are, what we want to investigate, what they can tell us about how the brain works. It's, for us, it's very stimulating. I mean, you can disagree, of course, but it's a starting point that it's very stimulating. And it's, I mean, of course, artworks have, particularly some artworks, not all of them, have particular values, symbolic or hedonic, or which kind of value. I mean, that we can share this aspect of art, I think, but...
May I continue this discussion? But I want to bring together, I want to try to bring together the two contributions of the afternoon, because since throughout the session, I had the intuition, which is, as my commentary will make clear, has not become completely, has not translated itself into more than an intuition, that the two contributions are very closely linked, and I think they might be closely linked around the problem of meaning and around the problem of the perception of movement. And I'm going to try to formulate my question or commentary, and part of it will touch on the issues that were already raised, to see how you react to it. So on the one hand, there is the whole problem of, in both cases, in Andrea's narrative about Warburg and about the other authors, as in Alessandra's report of the experiments, I think a crucial problem, and it's a crucial problem that brings them together, is the problem of meaning. Meaning in what sense? Okay, so in the case of the experiments, we have the problem that was raised twice already, which is that, well, as you know, there's one guy called Mark Bidlow who has specialized in doing paintings that look exactly like original paintings. So, for example, he reproduces a Pollock, and he calls it, not Pollock 1951-1, The problem is that this looks exactly like a Pollock, but it's not done with free drippings. It's done with very, very careful movements. So what is the significance of looking at it and somehow believing that this was done like this if it's not. You know what I mean? This is part of the point. You know, this is not even a copy that was done with the same technique and the same movement. It's a copy that looks exactly like the original, that is done with a technique that is exactly the opposite of the technique that was employed originally. And this comes into the problem of meaning. What does it mean to say that certain gestures or certain traces of gestures are meaningless, which is what you consider the Pollock traces or the Klein traces or the Fontana traces to be without meaning. How can they be without meaning, or in what sense are they without meaning? Aren't we attributing meaning to them anyways? Because, for example, we're attributing them whatever. It could be a symbolic meaning, but it could be a different type of meaning. For example, the patterns that look supposedly like they have the same graphic pattern as the Fontana cuts. Well, of course they have a meaning. They are we understand them sitting in the laboratory as stimuli in an experimental situation, so they have a huge amount of meaning, and the demands that are placed on the subject vis-a-vis those stimuli are absolutely full of meaning. So neither the ones in the art nor the ones in the as controlled stimuli can be said to be meaningless in any meaningful sense. And this brings me a little bit to the problem of the moving bodies and the attribution and the perception of movement. It's a kind of other side of the coin question. Would have Burckhardt or Wölfflin or Freud ever been able to describe Michelangelo's Moses as being placed in that moment of hesitation if A, for example, they didn't know the biblical narrative, B, if Moses had been represented in exactly the same position but without the tables of the law, for example, or if just a small difference had been, or if the foot, for example, had looked just a tiny bit different. Okay, this might be decisive, the foot, but you know what I mean. So I see that there is here, the problem that we are dealing with is to a large extent the problem of the meaning that is attributed or not attributed to movement, and what the conditions for the attribution of meaning can be. Because also, after all, you know, the different reactions of the experimental subjects to, for example, the movies, consist of attribution of meaning in a way. You know, they. So, you know, for example, you know, of a certain type of intentionality, or, you know, things like that. So I see here a problem that, you know, you see that it's not very well formulated, but I see here a common problem that you're dealing with in complementary perspectives, and maybe you can say both something to it.
Please. I have an idea, but for me it's much the first part.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Yeah, you touch upon very complicated issues. First of all, I know very well Alessandra's research on this attempt to interpret works of visual art in terms of neurosciences, and I'm very interested in them. The reason why I am interested in this kind of narrative or diegetic empathy that I try to describe is the fact that it seems to me that it expands our experience of virtuality and potentiality. Because if I see a cut by Lucio Fontana, a vertical cut, what I can experience in terms of embodied empathy is the gesture needed to produce that cut, either top-bottom or bottom-top. If I observe Medea meditating her vengeance, I can think of different possible actions. Of course, I know that the legend, or at least some traditions, tell us that the story had a certain end, that she actually killed her sons and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, in my imagination, in my imaginative faculty, I can work, and I like to work on possible different solutions. What could she do? She could perhaps decide in a different way, and this implies, of course, different actions, different motor processes, and different solutions, different actualizations of potentialities. And this, according to me, expands the idea of virtuality. And since we like, we are lazy, but we like to work, at least in the imagination, and expanded virtuality helps in enjoying works of art and images as a whole. Second point that you raise, of course, is very difficult because it raises issues that are crucial for iconology, ekphrasis, description of images. How can I describe an image? How much can I describe it in terms of pure visibility? Do I need a koine, a literary precognition of what happened, in this case, the veterotestamentary text work? It's very tricky. Of course, we cannot imagine a pure beholder, a pure spectator, just optically contemplating an image. I think that this kind of so-called pure visibilistic approach is not coherent, is not defendable, because we are never in front of pure images. We have different experiences. We have, of course, individual differences in our encyclopedia, in our knowledge of literary texts, of religious texts. But as a whole, this knowledge is always intertwined with our experience of the image. So it's very difficult to say to what extent our description of the image is based on pure optics, so to say, and to what extent it is also based on our global experience, knowledge, and precognition of the whole. So I would say that every time you have to be singular, somehow singular in the sense that you have to question the single image and to question the single beholder as well.
This is a problem for you too.
No, I mean, having a disembodied spectator, it's fortunately not possible, I think. But anyway, maybe I was wrong in the use of meaningless, because I used it as a synonymous of abstract. But
okay.
it was my fault.
I took it
and
to
I mean,
too strong.
I wanted to say maybe not univoc, not explicit meaning, but not real meaningless, because I agree completely with you. Our stimuli and our these images, these artworks are not meaningless for us and for the participants of the experiment.
Can I add
and
only?
Me too. I would like just briefly again about what he said and Chiara said. It's, I mean, I started my talk said that for me art is an expression of a human behavior. As a neuroscientist, I study human behavior. And so I am allowed to study also art because
yes, you're okay, yeah.
and to investigate how much and how does it impact in human brain, I think, because it is a product of human brain. So it's there together.
Yeah, only one little thing, because I underline the fact that singularity is important. I wouldn't like to be accused of relativism and subjectivism. On the other hand, a kind of universalism that comes out of the neuroscientific approach is also problematic to me. So I would say neither subjectivistic relativism nor objectivistic universalism, but a kind of subjectivistic universalism in the sense that you hope, when you describe, for example, an image, you hope that you will be able to convince everybody, but you're not sure that you will succeed.
Well, I think that was complicated words. So we reconvene at 4?